René Girard has been called the Einstein of the social sciences. Albert Einstein had pursued a theory of everything, a single framework which could explain all physical aspects of the universe. Girard similarly pursued a theory of everything for all human experience, one model which could connect everything from the Holocaust to Shakespeare to Bitcoin to bulimia. While Einstein never realized his dream, Girard may have succeeded in his lifetime. Not only does Girard's model fit the evidence, but it is easy to understand. Girard has also been called the Darwin of the human sciences because his theory is often compared to natural selection in both how simple it is and its immense explanatory power. But if this is true, why is his work not common knowledge? This will become clear, but first, what is this model and how did he find it? In 1872, Heinrich Schliemann discovered the lost city of Troy. He was not an archaeologist, but he had a genuine passion since he was young. Heinrich was convinced there were clues to literal truths in Homer's Iliad. He thought he could find a real lost city by following a piece of literature. He followed this belief until it brought him to a site he was convinced must be the place. A previous archaeologist had tried and failed to find anything there, but Heinrich poured his resources into it and famously succeeded in finding Troy. Similar to Heinrich, Girard began as an outsider to his ultimate fields of study, and he became convinced there were hidden clues to reality buried inside literature. As an academic, he taught literature for years when he began to notice something unique. The greater a writer was, the less variability in the structure of the relationships in their stories. When you peeled away the basic skin of a story, the characters were all following the same mechanism. The artists creating these stories had been approaching a consistent design the more that they studied human behavior and tried to create stories about it. The key feature was an illusion of desire. People have needs for objects such as food and shelter, instinctive needs for survival and growth of the species. These needs are authentic. We want medicine because we need medicine. But when we step away from needs and look at all other desire, it is not so simple. Girard proposes that there are no authentic desires for objects, even though we all believe they are real. The actual beginning of desire is when someone perceives another person to be satisfied or fulfilled in some way, and they want that state of being for themselves. Girard said, all desire is a desire to be. This origin of desire is preconscious. What is the preconscious? Consider an example. Bob has a nightmare. In his dream, he's late to work because he forgot to turn on his alarm. When Bob wakes up, he finds he actually had forgotten to turn it on. Part of his mind had realized this, but not his conscious mind. Another example is the common tip-of-the-tongue recollection phenomena. The preconscious acts like a storage space of information which is available for cognitive processing but currently lies outside conscious awareness. Much of the work therapists and psychoanalysts pursue involves the preconscious. In Girard's model, when a subject identifies a model person, the preconscious mind correlates an object with that model, an object supposedly at the source of their happiness. The subject person pursues this object in an attempt to achieve the state of being of the model. In this way, the subject does not have an authentic desire for the object. They are pursuing it to achieve the true goal, the perceived fulfillment of the model. Girard calls this mimetic desire. Keep in mind, the subject thinks they have a genuine desire for the object. As an example, Joe wants a mansion. In actuality, Joe once perceived someone as being fulfilled and they had a mansion. Joe thinks he wants it, but he may acquire a mansion one day and find this object does not give him the state of being he expected, the one he perceived in someone else. Note that mimetic desire is different from jealousy because that is a conscious emotion based on wanting what someone has at that moment. Mimetic desire is a more constructive device where you will work to attain the perceived state of being someone has by pursuing the relevant objects. At the heart of this model, people are looking for fulfillment and they cannot find it. Instead, the best guess they have is to observe who around them seems to have found it. Then they pursue whatever object seems responsible. Of course, the model is not fulfilled either, but the subject cannot know their state of being. It is all about perception. Now consider the model is just another person operating with the same mimetic structure. They own an object which may have some fundamental use or entertainment, but like all objects, it ultimately does not offer true fulfillment. However, they perceive other people pursuing them as the model by desiring their object. In a deeply ironic twist, the model will defend their claim to the object even though they know it doesn't grant the fulfillment they are all after. If someone displays a desperate longing for a trinket you thought was useless, maybe that trinket has some value you haven't discovered yet. This is the battle in the preconscious mind of the model. They want their object even more just because others want it. This battle between the subject and the model is called a mimetic conflict or mimetic rivalry. If a room of 30 toddlers are provided 30 identical toys, a struggle will develop over a toy. While it seems ridiculous to fight for the same toy, the conflict was never about the physical reality of the toys. Once one child perceived another to be happier than themselves, one specific toy became an object of desire, and the mimetic chain reaction began. Girard argues that maturity, in a social sense, is specifically learning how to mask your mimetic instincts because it is viewed as indecent and immature to be so obvious about our mimesis like children. The mimetic behavior is still there, but we are supposed to obscure it. Girard characterizes mimetic conflict into two types. Internal mediation is when the subject has access to the model, and as a result, mimetic rivalry can easily be created. This type of mediation is self-reinforcing because the feedback between the subject and the model will build through conflict. External mediation is when the subject has no access to the model, such as a famous movie star, so a direct conflict is much less likely to occur. This generally results in the subject maintaining a mimetic desire and working to achieve objects on their own which do not result in a rivalry. As the object of desire becomes increasingly difficult to achieve, such as the talent of a great musician, the subject grows in increasing awe of the model, and may assign a godlike status to their model, but when the objects are more easily achieved, the subject grows disinterest in the model as they approach the object. At an extreme state, a subject can grow what Girard called a metaphysical desire for their model. The desire is so pronounced that any disconnected object becomes lost, and the subject literally wants to be the model, their body, their essence, their identity. These concepts all fall into what is called the mimetic cycle or mimesis. We strive for an object, preconsciously believing it will bring us the fulfillment we perceived in someone else. When we acquire the object and it does not, we start over. Even as we are consciously ignorant of this dynamic, we have some recognition of it. In fact, Girard suggests it is essential in the depiction of human behavior. If an author does not display people behaving mimetically, their characters will appear fake and contrived. It is their mimetic nature which makes them authentic and recognizable. Of course, this is the basic concept on paper, and in application to real life it has more dimensions. We generally have many models, with varying degrees of importance. Similar to placing wagers, we are more convinced by some models than others, and we respond to their influence accordingly. Also, these mimetic relationships often occur as networks. There can be many subjects all following a single model. Not only do individuals behave mimetically, but entire organizations following human behavior, businesses, governments, religious institutions do as well. With billions of subjects and models interacting and pursuing objects, all of which are illusions of desire, there is great potential for macro-scale mimetic rivalry to develop and grow unbounded, even for objects which are ultimately pointless. This leads to another central concept in Girard's model, scapegoating. Consider a mimetic rivalry between two people which is growing. Maybe the object is a spouse, so there's only one. Or maybe it's a status of being the best at something, so there can only be one. There are situations where the rivalry cannot be practically resolved over an object. The feedback between the subject and the model grows until it reaches a state Girard calls doubles. At this phase, the object is lost from their view and the two people become fascinated with each other. Instead of trying to become the mentor by acquiring the object, the focus is now becoming the mentor through acquiring the competition. The goal is to both become the other and to destroy the other. The players will often behave exactly the same as they commit crimes, blaming the other while ignoring their own equal actions. This is familiar behavior on macro scale. Consider two rival governments. In this state, the parties will become increasingly dangerous to themselves and everyone around them. This conflict will accelerate until the ultimate conclusion, a universal resolution throughout human history for doubles, a scapegoat. While attacking with increasing desperation and denial, eventually an unrelated and innocent third party surfaces. It is essentially a random mechanism, though Girard identified some trends. The scapegoat generally has unique features that make them a minority, an outsider many people won't empathize with. Skin color, beliefs, anything that makes them unusual. In the chaos, this innocent party is both harmed, generally killed, and ironically blamed for the entire situation. As the scapegoat is dead, they cannot defend their own account of what happened. The mimetic crisis is ended. The doubles are no longer in conflict. The term scapegoat is not meant in the colloquial sense. They were not selected intentionally as a fall guy. Instead, the scapegoat mechanism is preconscious, just like the origin of desire. The doubles actually do rationalize the scapegoat is to blame, and this allows the conflict to end, but the scapegoat was genuinely innocent. Consider two tribes with a rivalry stemming from an object such as land. The rivalry becomes increasingly violent, chaos grows as they mimic one another. Over time, tribal members may not even remember what the original disputed object was. Innocents are killed, both sides view the other as inhumane while refusing to acknowledge their equal crimes. Eventually, one of the dead victims is a woman who happened to be unusual in some way, and she had a strange collection of sticks or figures. Suddenly the solution appears. She must have been a witch, and the entire feud was caused by her witchcraft. This innocent death provides a method to restore peace, because neither side is forced to confront their own mimetic faults. If this sounds unfamiliar, one of Girard's points is that scapegoating has been declining in modern societies as culture has developed on a global scale. The improvements in communication and education have reduced general willingness to accept an illogical scapegoat and to question powers which try to point to a scapegoat. As a result, global culture is largely contained to a mimetic stasis where the pressure is building and there is no relief valve in the historical sense. Simultaneously, our ability to cause massive damage in an instant has increased, so there is more reason than ever to be spreading the word that this instinct is not a functional solution. Soon after learning about the mimetic cycle and scapegoating, I sat to watch a short children's cartoon originally from South Korea with my toddler. The main character reads a comic and admires the superhero. He creates his own superhero costume in an effort to become the model. He runs around the neighborhood and the other children perceive his enjoyment. The other children create their own costumes. One day, all these children notice each other. They can't all be the superhero. They begin feuding for who the true superhero is, ironically becoming quite the opposite of superheroes. The frenzy becomes increasingly dangerous until they ultimately race down a street and crash into a random bystander's car, destroying it. The feud over the theoretical hero status is immediately dissolved, and they all run away home. This storyline is relatable for all ages because it is a PG-rated recreation of the mimetic cycle, which even in our suppression we recognize as authentic human behavior. In summary, mimesis, which influences all our desires and efforts, has the potential to create doubles who escalate in chaotic violence and denial until the death of an innocent third party provides a mechanism for resolution. Then, after a period of peace, the mimetic tension begins to boil and the process repeats. Scholars have called Girard's work an Archimedean point, a new vantage to review human history and creation, a God's eye view. The perspective is so powerful that it requires us to go back and reconsider everything we have done, and test if the evidence agrees with the theory. Girard obviously could not do this in one lifetime, so he focused on the area he was most familiar with. Girard explored literature. Cervantes, Stendhal, Proust, Dostoevsky, Shakespeare. He wrote 30 books, organizing and presenting the mimetic evidence from our best writers as well as religious texts. But the scope of all human creation remains. Meanwhile, the evidence is stacking up faster than ever. Girard lamented that he did not get the word out well enough. He did not focus on sharing his ideas in an accessible fashion because he felt they were obvious enough in themselves. But high academics today, even if they tried, are too far removed from being able to connect with the general public. There is a great need for a middleman to deliver this information in a relatable way. Church, government, and industry, major Western social power centers, all have reasons not to share Girard's theory, even as they may actively use it to their advantage. Rather than Girard's lessons being shared so that we may all redirect our efforts in a healthy way, this silence has allowed a global mimetic influence never seen before. Mimesis has now been aided by digital reach and social media platforms specifically crafted by Girard's personal students at Stanford who sought to use it for personal enrichment. With the basic concepts of the mimetic cycle and scapegoating explained, let's explore some examples and consider why our institutions do not make it a priority to share this information. Scholars have tried to understand what led many German people in the 1940s to agree they should toss Jewish babies into ovens, and Girard's model offers powerful evidence. His book, Scapegoat, explores examples throughout literature and history, from the mass murder of Jews in the medieval era for the Black Plague, to the myth of Oedipus, to the story of Jesus Christ. But before we delve into this, we must appreciate the implications of this model on ancient human history. Girard proposed that scapegoating is the origin of human culture. If the mimetic cycle is the governing source of all human behavior, we must consider humans from the very beginning. Girard believed this process may have begun before Homo sapiens. Other hominids could have been familiar with scapegoating. Apes have been noted to exhibit both mimetic behavior and choosing to stop themselves from mimetic behavior to avoid conflict. Consider ancient people attempting to socialize or organize in any fashion before even language existed, and their mimetic behavior was as unrefined and obvious as our children fighting over toys. It is inevitable that the natural mimetic process played out and a scapegoat was used. This happened any number of times before the observation was made. When someone is killed, peace is restored. Over a large span of time, it is eventually considered that if the killing was planned, like a ritual sacrifice, the peace would be continuous without the constant cyclical upheaval. In fact, this is true. The mimetic pressure which naturally builds in a group will be generally managed if there is a preordained scapegoat which people can assign all their problems to. The planned scapegoat, in the common sense, can be used to curb uncontrolled rivalries and the chaos ultimately leading to an unplanned scapegoat in the Girardian sense. Thus, we find the globally common practice of sacrifice in ancient cultures. Girard noted some important features of scapegoating other than just resolving the conflict of doubles. It is a socially bonding and powerful tool. There is no stronger way for someone to demonstrate they are part of the group than to participate in scapegoating a victim. Racial strife across human history provides endless examples on this topic. On mass scale, this scapegoat tool often has irresistible draw like bugs to a light, which has been noticed by political leaders since ancient humans. The mystique of shamans, like the druids of the Gauls, becomes clear. Whereas the sacrifice used by ancient humans was arrived at by simple observation, the tribal understanding of it developed over thousands of years. Even while cultures developed and humans grew in appreciation for social structure, tribal leaders knew and passed down the dark secret to maintaining group stability. Someone genuinely innocent had to die on a routine basis. This was the centerpiece of developing ancient rituals and religions. These structures existed as an attempt to keep groups of people from constantly devolving into mimetic feuds which threatened the survival of the whole group. Girard notes that the origin of social prohibitions was also an attempt to dampen mimetic rivalry. Freud's Totem and Taboo presents a similar thesis that the origin of culture was an original murder. Much of Freud's famous work, including the Oedipus complex, is recharacterized by Girard in a way that is simply more believable and explanatory. Freud came close to the answer, but the full explanation lies with the mimetic cycle. Relationships between children and their parents are governed by the same mimesis as all relationships, while incorporating the fact that parents will naturally be a mimetic model figure for their child. So the child will mimetically attempt to become the parent through whatever objects seem relevant. Hence, Freud's theory that all males are born wanting their mothers sexually is a poor estimation at the reality. Girard shows that males simply admire their fathers as a model and seek objects they believe will bring them to that state of being. It is no surprise that many children have the same profession as their parent model, even if it was not a forced or economic decision. Tribal cultures eventually began looking for alternative ways to solve the problem of mimesis. They wanted to preserve group stability without sacrificing resources like people or animals. Rituals were created like aggressive dances, which allowed people to release their mimetic tensions without actually acting on them. Some tribes found psychoactive drugs like peyote or ayahuasca, which interacted with the consciousness in a way that would break people free of their mimetic instincts, at least for a time. Tools like these were absorbed and sanctified into rituals and religions as alternative methods to maintain group stability and avoid the natural movement towards mimetic conflict. In the process, these cultures began to notice an enlightenment experience would occur when the routine process of mimetic conflict and scapegoating was rejected. When a mimetic crisis would occur, there was the normal temptation to fight for the object of desire. But when this was consciously rejected, it became logical to consider that neither themselves nor anyone else was the elusive model. Nobody was holding the object that would bring fulfillment. A recognition that the origin of desire was a lie, the mimetic cycle could be broken, and curiously, fulfillment may actually be the result of this choice. This enlightenment has been discovered in various cultures, and there were attempts to make religions after its pursuit as well. Rather than periodically suppress mimetic instincts with rituals, the aim was to consciously and permanently reject mimesis through peaceful consideration. These religions had a more challenging path to grow in numbers, because scapegoating had been such a useful, socially bonding tool which was easily agreed upon by the masses. In addition, these practices do not offer the highly desirable economic productivity that is offered by harnessing mimetic desire, as clearly seen in modern first-world countries. This is a key feature of mimesis. It may be the source of all human conflict, but it also provides the most powerful engine for productivity. Few examples highlight the conflict between an ancient cultural resistance of mimesis for social stability and a modern push for mimetic productivity, as well as the history of Potlatch in North America or Kula in Papua New Guinea. Tribal cultures on opposite sides of the planet conceived a similar strategy to reigning in mimesis. Instead of suppressing mimetic desire, they repurposed it. The position of highest respect was deliberately assigned to the tribal member who practiced giving away the most goods. Tribal families and leaders engaged in mimetic competition, but rather than spiraling into violence and scapegoating, there was an inherent positivity to their goal and the relationships formed by it. This clever design succeeded for many generations, sanctified similarly to religions elsewhere, understood to be a foundation of their identity and social fabric. This may have been a progressive step in the history of mimesis, but it was ultimately met with disgust by invading cultures which had fully incorporated mimetic desire and all its inevitable individualistic tendencies in the pursuit of economic growth and optimization. When potlatching was made illegal in Canada, it was described as a worse-than-useless custom that was wasteful, unproductive, and contrary to the civilized values of accumulation. Canada began imprisoning natives who attempted to cling to their long-established method for controlling social mimesis in an effort to assimilate them into a modern system. After nearly 100 years, Canada repealed the ban and apologized for their attack on Potlatch, but the results their early leaders had in mind had already largely been achieved. Potlatch was remembered mostly by senior tribespeople, while newer generations had increasingly become accustomed to modern individualist concepts. As cultures around the world adopted various techniques to divert mimetic instincts, the most powerful civilizations became the ones who found that resisting mimesis was not the most prosperous solution. Instead, building a society where mimetic desire was socially encouraged within enforceable boundaries that limited scapegoating resulted in the most exponential growth. Compared to ancient tribal economies, take note of a ubiquitous tool which facilitated mimesis, the invention of currency. Whereas the pursuit of objects was reasonably short-lived when people were competing for fixed items like animals or land, the introduction of currency allowed mimesis to influence behavior continuously and infinitely. Even today, people want to be millionaires, but as they approach that goal, they want to be billionaires. The object of desire floats ever upwards in the form of a theoretical number as the subject keeps chasing it. The objects of influence and power have always existed, but currency makes it clear and accessible at all social levels. In effect, money organizes and optimizes mimesis. Similarly, capitalism has proven the most effective way to facilitate mimesis and its associated productivity. Other economic structures limited the masses to assigned roles and fixed earnings for the benefit of despotic leaders. This only limited the total potential of mimesis. The whole population had a lower quality of life for the lifestyle of a few. Capitalism allows everyone to embrace their individual mimetic tendencies and produce value. If someone has aspirations for wealth and power, the only question is how mimetic will they be? The strengths and weaknesses of this design are self-evident in modern cultures. In the timeline of mimesis and cultural evolution, a primary focus of Girard was the history of how people first arrived at the idea that they should resist their instincts and reject scapegoating. Many civilizations utilized an original murder myth. Consider the Romans, the Greeks, the Maya. Mythology was used to characterize a scapegoating event in a way that honored the murderer and claimed the victim deserved to die by some unreasonable stretch of logic. 2,000 years ago, there was the first text which made a complete departure from justifying scapegoating. The central theme and purpose was proving that scapegoating was wrong because the sacrificed victim was innocent. This was the story of Jesus Christ in the Bible. With a Girardian perspective, the sometimes vengeful, sacrifice-demanding God of the Old Testament is revealed as the same misguided human perception shared by all ancient pagan religions. Girard calls the Bible a text in travail, an unmasking of the scapegoat mechanism by people still caught up in it. The violence and retaliation of a perceived God evolves over centuries into themes of forgiveness and empathy. The people are bonded to the cycle of mimesis and violent instability, but Jesus Christ comes to preach an alternative way of life which rejects the instincts created by mimesis. He does this while knowing that the people, even listening to his words, cannot actually be freed from this cycle until he is sacrificed and proves that scapegoating is wrong. One example is Peter's denial, where Jesus anticipates that even his closest followers are not capable of following the path of rejecting scapegoating with him. This was not intended to be a fortune-telling demonstration. It was based on the logic that Jesus recognized people had never broken free from these instincts before, and he didn't expect them to. The power of mimesis and scapegoating had always been too strong for any man to overcome. So Peter joins the crowd, and Jesus goes willingly to break the cycle with his death and resurrection in the text. Whether or not the stories of the text are real or that they come from a higher power is unrelated from the academic point being made, which is that this is the first recorded text which clearly condemns the scapegoating process. Unlike all previous texts, which vindicated the murder of a victim and characterized the sacrifice as one who deserved to die for the good of the many. Girard calls the Bible an anti-myth text. Mythology had been used to obfuscate the dark reality of scapegoating and vindicate the murderers, such as how Romulus was justified in killing Remus, whereas in the Bible Cain was not justified for killing Abel. The Old Testament is a mixture of supporting and resisting scapegoating, which moves linearly towards forgiveness and ultimately peaks with the story of Jesus. Observe the continuous move away from ritual sacrifice. Consider the story of Adam and Eve with a Girardian perspective. Two people lived in a state of theoretical fulfillment, but Satan convinces Eve that there is a higher state of being, and the path to this state of being was through an object, the apple. So begins the first mimetic cycle, which people have repeated ever since. Again, whether or not the story is real is unrelated from how the text is serving a model of the mimetic theory and stating is the origin of humanity's problems, i.e. original sin, the intrinsic fault born into all people. Institutional Christianity historically failed to recognize these themes. Instead, it was misconstrued in any number of ways, including to persecute and scapegoat women for the role of Eve in the story. This misinterpretation was made easier by how God threw a tantrum and began punishing everyone for what they did, characteristic of the Old Testament perceptions of God. A New Testament interpretation would rephrase to state that people separate themselves from the path Jesus Christ demonstrated when they pursue mimetic desire, rather than how a vengeful personified God assaults them. If the text in travail is not recognized, biblical stories can be cherry-picked to justify any dogma. Institutional Christianity has curiously reflected the Bible in the sense that it has been an organization in travail. Even 1,500 years after the life of Jesus Christ, the European wars of religion resulted in over 10 million deaths. In spite of the name, faith and spirituality had little to do with these thinly veiled mimetic rivalries for power. with the scapegoating of sects against each other mirroring their general practice of scapegoating other minorities, and contrasting to the central anti-scapegoating message of Christian text, it is objectively clear that the Church was not measurably Christian for most of its history. However, in the most recent centuries, it has largely distanced itself from routine scapegoating and moved closer to the message it is intended to deliver. This transition away from a nearly tribal structure has not been without friction, especially when the religion is practiced in vastly different socioeconomic regions. The modern Methodist Church is currently in turmoil over how the Western audience now rejects scapegoating homosexuals, while the African portion of the Church strongly embraces the social cohesion it grants them. In a situation similar to the global abandonment of coal generation, less developed countries are pointing to the history of the West and highlighting the irony that the West demands other countries abandon these tools when they were exactly what was used to establish their own foundation. Institutional Christianity continues a bumpy but overall positive path as an organization in travail, but not without reminders of where it has come from. With this in mind, the synergy with the text of the Bible placed Girard's theory in a precarious position. One might expect a religion to gladly receive rational support from an area of academia, but the reality is the implications of Girardian thought are dramatic and difficult to navigate with such a diverse following. Attempting to rapidly evolve the dogmas of various subgroups has had mixed results historically. But whether intentionally or not, the Church adapted mimetic theory in its own evolution over the past few decades. As Girard has stated, scapegoating has lost social favor in modern societies, yet at the same time they have become incredibly mimetic. Churches popularly trended away from traditional styles of Mass, which incorporated lectures, rituals, hooded robes, candlelight, ancient pagan techniques used to rally audiences into unity, often via a denounced scapegoat. Instead, they adopted contemporary services which used mimesis to their favor. A display of exciting, emotional live music and baptisms are used to broadcast the impression to an audience that their members are fulfilled, attracting converts. The object of desire is belonging to their system. Is adopting mimetic design for benefit a bad thing? While scapegoating is unquestionably negative, what about the core mimetic process? Dr. Vittoria Gaese, an expert in neuroscience and professor of psychobiology, wrote an article on this topic, The Two Sides of Mimesis, after his discovery of mirror neurons in primates. Dr. Gaese emphasizes that mimesis is associated with humanity's finest achievements, as well as the worst abominations. On an individualized scale, mimetic behavior is fundamental to human cognitive development and learning. An existence without mimesis, if even possible, seems inadvisable. The function of Dr. Gaese's mirror neurons is intensely debated, but there is at least a potential to link mimetic behavior to a biological mechanism. Whether or not neuroscience reaches a level of sophistication to make a determination on this one day, it does seem that mimetic instinct is fundamental and unavoidable. The Bible's concept of an original sin, a curse which humanity cannot be fulfilled with or without, may be reasonably accurate. With no mimetic tendencies, we would have minimal productivity and our quality of life would measurably diminish. As resources and opportunities depleted, education would also decline. With enough time, tribalism and scapegoating would again be the norm. Ursula K. Le Guin's Hugo Award-winning story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, paints a celebratory picture of people who abandon all modern society when discovering that it is inextricably connected to scapegoating. But it fails to address the reality that individuals who wander out into a distant forest will inevitably start back over with the tribal structure which involves pervasive needs for scapegoating. This can be witnessed in real time today by nature of how convicted criminals are cut off from modern society. The evolution of prison gangs is no different than the story of ancient tribes. They form as a stabilizing force. In many countries, the prisons themselves understand this and work together with the gangs, for example isolating them into separate blocks, because they know allowing this tribal structure, which still has occasional outbursts of scapegoating violence, is much superior to unbound mimetic rivalry between all prisoners. But a complete embrace and defense of mimesis also has clear negatives. one recent example being the American opioid crisis. The Sackler family was so dedicated to a mimetic desire for wealth that mass murder with pharmaceuticals became palatable. Whereas the characters in the children's cartoons scurried home after their mimetic interactions resulted in a bystander's damaged car, the reality and inescapability of innocent victims via scapegoating becomes much clearer in this example. Patients who had originally gone to doctors for legitimate purposes were deceived with some of the most addictive drugs known to science. Inhumane scenes became common, with entire families overdosing and dying together. Hundreds of thousands of pointless deaths spawned from the Sacklers' mimetic desire for wealth. This system was able to continue for so long in part by the stigma against addicts, i.e., blaming innocent minority scapegoats for the violence being done to them, the classic mythological storyline. Eventually, given the first world environment of the opioid crisis, the government was pressured to get involved and stop the killing. With a rejection of mimesis and an embrace of mimesis both serving as measurably dangerous outcomes, it seems that a pendulum system is the most optimal to manage the problem. As a result, we find the globally common first world solution of two-party governments. Functionally, there is always a conservative group and a liberal group. The conservative group, by nature of the mimetic history previously outlined, is logically loyal to mimesis because it is the process by which the society grew from whatever archaic beginnings it had. By contrast, the liberal group challenges mimetic influence. If one party gained absolute control and implemented its objective to the core, it would be a disaster. But we need each one to advocate its basic purpose and keep us generally meandering between the two extremes. As we drift too far to one end, the flaws of that philosophy become increasingly revealed and we repel back towards the center. Both parties function largely by the same token, claiming they are the solution to scapegoating. The conservatives emphasize that a dedication to mimesis is why the society has overwhelmingly become great, as opposed to dark corners of the world where they still adhere to barbarism in an attempt to maintain social order. The liberals highlight remaining areas where scapegoating has not been completely eliminated, and in some instances is even growing by nature of mimetic pursuits run unchecked. In reality, both of these narratives are true, but neither party may be fully trusted. The only stable solution is a system which swings between their interests. It does not create a perfect society, but it does largely mitigate the worst examples of scapegoating. In fact, it is so effective that modern cultures have become largely unaware of how bad it would otherwise be. For example, few Western people are familiar with the reality that thousands of children, disabled, albino, or otherwise minority scapegoats are still sacrificed annually through witch hunts, in part to blame them for diseases like HIV and create social stability. Governments are intimately involved with fostering and shaping mimetic behavior. After all, they are an evolution of this objective from its earliest tribal roots. With the resources and intelligence of first world countries, they are no stranger to incorporating psychology to meet their objectives, for example, the work of Edward Bernays. The American government has consulted with Girardian experts on the topic of handling international conflict. Girard's model exposes the design and purpose of government and politics similarly to how it shines a light on the history and function of institutional religions. As such, governments have no more interest in publicly sharing Girard's message than the Church does. Instead, they would prefer to adapt it to their benefit. Additionally, Girard's model and his pro-Christ interpretation pose a functional problem. Girard advocates that the message of the Bible is the ultimate solution for the mimetic problem. Specifically, people should assign God to the role of mentor status in the way Jesus demonstrated. This would effectively undo the never-ending cycle of acquisition, disappointment, and violence that comes from aspiring to the perceived mentor status of other people. While he proposes a Christian solution to the challenge of mimesis and scapegoating, Girard also notes that Christianity is the only religion to predict its own failure on earth. Governments are faced with handling the practical reality that most people are not going to follow this advice, and they need a system to keep social order. Not only that, but a significant redirection away from mimesis would weaken an economy and make it a target for more mimetic societies, a recreation of what happened to the tribes built on Potlatch. The business world naturally has a similar relationship with Girard's theory. By design, businesses are interested in how it can be used for centralized gain. Mimetic theory can be explored from the interpersonal culture of hierarchy structures to competition between companies to stock trading. One example rises above all others because he explicitly used mimesis to become one of the wealthiest people on earth, Peter Thiel. While at Stanford, Thiel was instructed in mimetic theory by Girard. Thiel was so influenced that he has stated his religion as René Girard's Christian anthropology. In 2004, Thiel became the first major investor in Facebook, purchasing over 10% ownership for $500,000. He joined the board of directors the following year. While the infant social media concept had begun brewing organically, it was a no-brainer for one of the few people in Silicon Valley aware of mimetic theory. A digital platform to organize and optimize mimesis at a level never seen before. People no longer needed dinner parties to peacock their objects and compete for model status. Instead, it could be a 24/7 engagement. Even with Thiel's clear insight into how he could exploit human behavior, we cannot know if he anticipated just how correct he was. Digitizing social mimesis rapidly transformed cultures around the world. The evidence of mimetic behavior and rivalry in social media is overwhelming and self-evident. But there are some features of the broad social shift which deserve some attention. First, brand name luxury objects lost a significant amount of market demand. Once social media began interacting with minds at an overwhelming frequency, perceived mentors radically changed. As compared to earlier generations where people might spend their time walking around admiring objects like houses or cars, the digitized consumers were less influenced by classical objects of wealth. People no longer needed a luxury watch in the competition to become the model figure in their network. In fact, a backlash began to develop against these objects. A new generation perceived mimetic models from their digital presence, and they preached more abstract objects as their source of fulfillment. Billions of people began reflecting woke, free, enlightened lifestyles and wisdom through online personas, while ironically becoming more mimetically enslaved than any group of people who have existed in history. As participants competed to demonstrate how free and original they were with their lifestyles, Mount Everest began setting new records for deaths. It became so crowded with people documenting themselves that the climb became a continuous line of people. This slowed the speed with which people could traditionally progress through the climb and dangerously increased exposure to the elements. Unfortunately, the innocent deaths from the new digital mimetic age were not remotely contained to small examples such as this. Laws had to be made to control the amount of fatalities resulting from people using social media while driving. The unprecedented reach of mimetic tension in society fostered new scapegoating events. Mass shootings transformed from a generational incident to a continuous problem, with perpetrators commonly exhibiting dramatic social media histories and even planning final messages on the platform, messages they were willing to kill and or die for so they could reach a perceived status of mentor and have their voice heard. The traditional stresses of youth became amplified by a digital platform which was visible to everyone and never turned off. Of course, the same features apply to social media as any other mimetic system. Scapegoating was not the only result. In fact, it was a minor portion of the full impact. Enormous economic prosperity was generated, both for the original stakeholders and many who interacted in this new marketplace. Meaningful positive results can be measured directly and indirectly. For example, social media has optimized charitable giving in many ways, reducing barriers for global communication and increasing economic opportunities invariably resulted in instances of reduced tribal scapegoating, i.e. scapegoating for social stability or cultural convenience. Practices which may have carried on quietly in some corner of the world suddenly became exposed and virally criticized by millions of people who may even donate funding towards causes which fight these traditions. As a whole, digitalized social mimesis offered all of the costs and benefits that would be expected from a Girardian perspective. vast benefits economically and socially, which also shifts society towards the right end of the mimetic spectrum, where rivalry becomes an exponential influence. Social media may have organized interpersonal mimesis, but it is not the sole example of Girardian structure on the internet. Some characteristics of online mimesis had already begun. Wikipedia was created through harnessing mimetic rivalry. Cunningham's law, named for the founder of Wikipedia, notes that the best way to get the right answer on the internet is not to ask a question, it's to post the wrong answer. People are stimulated into rivalry when someone claims they have knowledge, the object that establishes them as the mentor, but this rivalry does not exist when someone is asking a question which will not be perceived as an attempt to be the mentor. If you've wondered why online media outlets have such poor grammar in their headlines, they benefit from the viral growth created from all the people commenting to correct their error. The universal tendency towards rivalry is so strong and self-sustaining that Wikipedia simply had to provide a platform to organize this mechanism and present a well-organized result. This is hardly surprising today when observing that nearly all social media conversations spiral into similar rivalries over who is the mentor with the object of knowledge. It is intriguing to note the impact of anonymity here. In person, adults are universally taught to obfuscate their mimetic tendencies, maturity, as Girard says. Yet, when they are anonymous and unaccountable, they are more likely to revert to an infant state where mimetic rivalry runs rampant. The influence of this anonymity may be observed in other social settings, for example, violence in driving automobiles. It is commonly observed that people will radically skew towards violence and scapegoating out of a slight inconvenience or rivalry which occurs when driving. This sort of behavior would unquestionably not exist in a grocery store line, but when people feel anonymous in a vehicle, the ubiquitous guidelines of social maturity and mimetic management are much more likely to disappear. Peter Thiel sold most of his Facebook shares in 2012 as competing social media platforms like Twitter grew exponentially. Facebook's one limitation was that it could not satisfy the limitless mimetic demand. People did not want to post 1 or 2 stories per day. They wanted a platform where it was socially acceptable to broadcast all the time. This high-frequency mimesis is now accommodated by various companies like Instagram and Twitter. Thiel remained on the board of Facebook, but he explored new ways to monetize his knowledge of mimesis. One successful example was Bitcoin. This was a trading instrument which had no intrinsic company value, quarterly announcements, operational hiccups, or insider knowledge which could influence the price behavior. Bitcoin operated on pure mimesis. If people believed it was valuable, it would be self-fulfilling. The missing ingredient was a model figure who could lead everyone to believe it was valuable. Thiel had already established himself as a model in the business world due to his unique success, so Thiel invested $20 million into Bitcoin in early 2017 while it was stagnant, and began the simple work of alerting the media that he had done so. The mimetic reaction was exponential, and his fund reported hundreds of millions in earnings within a year. Bitcoin became a viral phenomenon. The puppeteer Thiel cashed out, and the product's viral growth was discontinued. It should not be surprising to learn that Facebook began discussing a digital currency in the wake of this event. Thiel saw the obvious opportunity to create yet another mimetic device for profit by combining his 2 experiments. Thiel may not be the only billionaire to shape public desire using mimesis. Before the age of social media, Thiel created PayPal and went public in 2012, which he merged and developed with Elon Musk's banking company at the time. This was the first success which made them billionaires together. As Thiel is surprisingly open and vocal about his focus on mimesis in business, he very likely discussed it with his partner. When the rise of Thiel's social media decreased demand for traditional opulent goods, Musk apparently noticed an opportunity. There was a global need for investments in alternative power generation and transportation, but the cost was prohibitive. At the same time, wealthy people inevitably wanted to play the mimetic model role, but their options to behave this way had become limited. Posting luxury objects did not gain positive attention in the new, woke, digital world. That was the tasteless mimesis of the past generation. Musk provided them a new option. Now the wealthy can broadcast how virtuous they are through a display of expensive Tesla cars or Tesla roof tiles. Girard noted through the works of Rousseau and Heidegger that attempts to expose or outflank mimesis would only result in mimesis being played at a higher level. So the upper class graduated one tier. Now the wealthy can appear as though they are not buying luxury objects to show wealth, they are doing it because of what good people they are. This trend of logic became known as virtue signaling. As ironic as it is to use base mimetic desires to help people pretend to be honorable, this shift of private wealth into R&D for the alternative power and transport sector is one of the more positive results of using mimesis, though without mimesis, humanity wouldn't need a solution for unbounded consumption and pollution in the first place. The modern oligarchs have begun to explicitly recognize the fact that there is one distinct method to gaining extreme wealth: facilitate mimesis on grand scale. Some of the world's largest companies became powerful without charging users a penny. The wealth of Google and Facebook stems from advertising. These services provide a method for mimetic desire to spread itself into global daily life. Amazon created a more streamlined way for people to acquire objects. Apple gave mimesis a new platform to reach people at all times. It is hardly surprising to see Elon Musk announcing a venture to incorporate computer chips into human brains. The world's most powerful people are moving as fast as they can to increase mimetic liquidity. Technology which can hardly be considered viable or even desirable is already being preached as the future because they now understand the template: facilitate the expansion of mimesis in return for personal wealth. Governments, businesses, and institutional religions are all built upon a relationship with the mimetic process. But mimesis is not restricted to large organizations. Its influence appears throughout culture and daily life. As Girard noted, mimetic design is required to create accurate descriptions of human behavior in art. In at least one case, an author may have dedicated his adult life to crafting a story about his personal discovery in view of mimesis. It became the most circulated non-religious text in history. However, few people have observed this hidden purpose. Instead, as Girard noted, art is naturally appealing if it effectively captures the essence of the mimetic structure. The work in question is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. A Girardian analysis reveals that The Lord of the Rings is not uniquely successful because of the skin of the story. Of all fiction or non-fiction ever written, the characters, setting, and details are not so incomparably excellent to surpass all other stories. Instead, people are drawn to it for the narrative hiding beneath the surface, which we find uniquely appealing and informative to our nature. The one ring to rule them all may be reconsidered as the one system which rules them all, the mimetic cycle. A physical embodiment of the circular pattern quietly driving all desire, growth, conflict, power, and disaster. Tolkien explores through each character individual examples of how people or organizations may rise or fall in their relationship to mimesis, now exposed as a trinket. The inscription on the ring: one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. In so few words, one can see the viral growth of mimesis across the world in the span of history. From ancient empires to colonial manifest destiny, and even today, mimesis has guaranteed its growth by promise of economic stimulation. Tribes were rapidly overpowered, exterminated, converted, or quarantined. Culturally unproductive countries were driven into ruin. Dictatorships were increasingly pressured to adopt more capitalist behavior, otherwise they would become overpowered in time. These are all symptoms of the underlying trend towards mimetically optimized systems. Mimesis does not want peaceful tribes, nor does it want isolated dictators. It demands universal human participation. A key feature of the ring is how it offers power, which most believe can be used to their benefit. But the wise characters recognize that it cannot be controlled. Even if someone tried to wield it with pure intentions, eventually the ring would enact damage through them. It may not appear fundamentally evil, but it is unavoidably corrupt and unstable. There are many examples where mimetic pursuits were positively constructive, but an unwavering loyalty to mimesis inevitably trends towards rivalry and scapegoating. The negative results are not immediately obvious, nor are they obvious in retrospect. Crimes drift into mythology or obscurity. At most, a single mystical villain like Adolf Hitler is identified and made synonymous with the atrocities, rather than a recognition of the vast human participation and support which actually made them possible. The characters and settings of Lord of the Rings all provide methods for Tolkien to explore the mimetic process. Boromir demonstrates the fall of men who lust for the power of mimesis even with what they believe to be good intentions. Aragorn, the theoretical ideal leader of men, someone who recognizes the mimetic flaw born into all people, he accepts the power thrust upon him only to save his loved ones. He does all he can to resist and oppose the ring with the support of Gandalf, the overt Christ figure. Saruman represents organized government. A dignified icon with the potential for greatness instead becomes the most useful ally of the ring. He breeds a mindless army using energy from the careless exploitation of nature. Ultimately, he's brought down by the force of nature itself, something he underestimated. The inseparable main characters, Frodo and Sam, cumulatively represent the reader, the two sides of our character. The adventurous, ambitious side, the piece of us represented by Frodo, is susceptible to discovering and engaging mimesis. The innocent, love-based side shown by Sam remains pure and untarnished. Their journey together represents everyone's story, where we inevitably carry the burden of mimetic influence in our path through a mimetically dominated world. In conclusion, Tolkien advocates that only in making peace with the side of ourselves which was inevitably corrupted, we can embrace the best aspects of our character and move onwards towards a better life. Having studied Tolkien's work for a number of years, when first discovering the mimetic model, I recognized how it filled in remaining questions about his text. I wondered if anyone else had found this, but it did not take long to see others had come first. Peter Thiel had named many of his companies after Tolkien's work, Valar Ventures, Mithril Capital. He even had the cheek to name his $20 billion CIA-backed data intelligence company, Palantir, after the tool used by the corrupt Saruman, i.e. the government, to spy on everyone. Within Christian academic circles, both Tolkien and Girard are some of the most influential contributors in the last century, so these academics have also begun to notice compatibility between their works. As Tolkien never revealed the specific intention of his fiction, and he came before Girard, there is no way to know precisely how much Tolkien had grasped about the mimetic cycle and all its implications. But his message was clear, and to some criticism, one-sided. Literary critics have noted, regardless of any mimetic subplot, that Tolkien's world had an unrealistic delineation between pure good and pure evil. If the ring is intended to be Tolkien's private understanding of mimetic forces, his stance is that any participation is corrupt and inevitably destructive. While this perspective makes it simple to judge what is right and wrong in our world, it is unfortunately challenging and limiting to apply this to our lives. Girard actually disagreed with a one-sided interpretation of mimesis. He proposed that it was capable of both good and evil, although its increased use would trend towards scapegoating, which was always negative. If Tolkien was strictly negative about mimesis, he can hardly be blamed for it. Having fought in World War I and observing World War II, he was very familiar with violence resulting from mimetic objectives. The psychological anguish of the soldier is born from witnessing the reality of scapegoating. Mimetic pressure has grown immeasurably in all aspects of modern life. Culture has shifted from a time where popular music used to be a contemplation of mimetic influence and resistance, to an overwhelming embrace of mimetic desire. While the message is popularly viewed as empowering, it is a transparent celebration of mimesis. Actually, it is most effectively compared to contemporary LaVeyan Satanism. Contrary to popular perception, modern Satanists do not even believe in Satan or any deities. They only recognize human history and the dominance of mimetic behavior. but instead of obscuring their mimetic symptoms, they directly recognize and sanctify them. The pursuit of desire is itself their focus. They identically view this as empowering. Satanism is simply the worship of Mimesis. As modern culture has flipped from the resistance of Mimesis to its embrace, it has simply paralleled the goals outlined by Satanists. This is a dramatic statement, but it is objectively accurate. Much of modern pop music could easily be the soundtrack of a Satanist movement. Every line is simply the assertion of desires, the rivalry against others for those desires, and the worship of the self for ascending to a model status through the unabashed pursuit of desires. Of course, this is just an observation of popular music. There are always artists creating work from other positions on the mimetic spectrum. In the past 10 to 20 years, artists with messages that questioned mimetic influence were increasingly categorized as unusual or cult works. I hope students will make their own judgments with the Girardian perspective after this introduction. There are more art forms to consider than the traditional books, music, and movies. Video games have become an enormous industry globally, particularly in mimetically charged cultures. The landscape for games is radically different than decades ago. Major factors include the connectivity of the internet and access of mobile phones. Mobile gaming has become the largest market segment. At $50 billion in 2017, mobile games became a bigger business than Hollywood. Unlike 10 to 30 years ago, when games were generally interactive stories, they are now commonly used as a corporate device to monetize mimetic instincts. An environment is created to stimulate a player's desire for model status through objects. There are some cases where people have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on virtual objects. This uniquely demonstrates how the reality of an object, pixels on a screen, is entirely irrelevant to the power of mimetic desire. In most cases, the cost is not monetary. Instead, it is the time invested in these virtual hamster wheels pursuing desire for objects. Mimesis influences culture, and culture extends beyond art. As a teen working in a restaurant, I became convinced there was a deeper reason for some peculiar customer behavior. After opening, we could be empty for hours. But with overwhelming likelihood, once a single customer came in, we would always have a flood of them within moments. It was not rationally explained by a lunch rush. It was not always at the same time of day. It could be much earlier or later. A statistical approach would expect a more symmetric, gradual increase and decline around dining hours. Something almost mystical was making people follow once a single person broke the boundary. As an adult, I finally tested a Girardian theory on this behavior. At a mall during lunch hours, one of the lunch vendors did not have a single customer while others were full. But once I stepped up to the counter, many others began to form a line. It is likely that even these basic choices may be influenced by mimesis between consumers. People are more easily stimulated to desire by a suspicion that another person is satisfied by an object rather than a standalone object attempting to display that it is desirable. Store owners might benefit by having an employee pose as a customer even if there are none. Girard's model may be powerfully insightful, but it is not always so simple to use. If this truly is a functional theory of everything, then nothing should be off-limits for consideration. One frequently relevant social topic which stands out is homosexuality. Can mimesis offer clarity? Girard, of course, anticipates that sexual competition or compatibility is mimetically driven, regardless of orientation. He does speculate on the origin of a homosexuality, that as people compete for the intention of sexual partners, objects, it is possible to experience the transition of desire from the object to the rival, a similar structure to mimetic competitors which become doubles. This may be particularly relevant when the competitor comes to believe that they cannot win in the feud for the object, instead transitioning their desire into becoming or absorbing the competition. This concept may have merit, but it seems limiting to declare a single perspective on how the mimetic model could influence someone's orientation. It is easy to imagine an alternative example where an individual perceives others of the opposite sex to have greater fulfillment, and in a desire to acquire this for themselves, they seek to obtain objects related to that identity, which would include people of their own sex. In all the complex lives of real people, there are surely countless ways the mimetic model could be reorganized around models and objects. It is better to rely on the model itself rather than globally apply a single interpretation, because people begin with wide-ranging initial conditions. In summary, just because Girard's model offers insight, it does not guarantee the correct interpretation. But it does remain likely that a Girardian perspective can bring some new insight and expose correlations between mimetic behavior and sexuality. It is sometimes observed, even in young people who do not have a sexual identity, that they seem homosexual, though there may not be clear reasons why. This could be a social recognition of someone who is not interacting and competing mimetically in the expected sense, something we find difficult to define because of the denial of our own internal mimesis. Conflating homosexuality and anti-mimetic behavior can be observed elsewhere. Decades ago, when anti-mimetic messages became common in popular music, rock stars would naturally dress and behave in ways that subverted mimetic norms, and frequently this would be associated with a misnomer that they were homosexual. In reality, these musicians may be exclusively heterosexual, even notoriously active heterosexuals. Mimetic industrial societies have attempted to combat anti-mimetic influence by boxing it in with homosexuality, particularly because homosexuality has proven a well-accepted historical scapegoat. The New York Times did a piece on Harvard Business School graduates and discovered they were among the least happy people in the country. They were less fulfilled than janitors who took pride in their work which was perceived to help others. In an age where people are commonly self-identifying as having an addictive personality, the reality is that digitized mimesis has universally pushed us to the far right end of the mimetic spectrum, and the rewards for our extreme productivity may be surprising. It is curious how apocalyptic media has grown in demand during this time, with end-of-the-world premises becoming very popular. The cumulative social conscious seems instinctively hardwired to expect a cataclysmic scapegoating event to relieve us from our mimetic imbalance. Girard's research offers an alternative to consider. We can measure that our power-hungry leaders are fundamentally unhappy people. It is genuinely unnecessary to play the mimetic game this aggressively, because there is no grand prize waiting at the end. Only a slow dawning realization that our objects will not provide the fulfillment we expected of them. This is not to say that working towards goals is fruitless. Rather, we should continue to work hard, but towards targets we can actually expect positive results from. We should seek parity between time invested in mimetic pursuits and non-mimetic activities. The object is not to shift into the far left of the mimetic spectrum, rather it is to find functional balance. In my experience thus far, creativity has become a valuable function. Of course, it can become mimetic if it is allowed to move that direction, but if it is kept personally meaningful rather than a rivalry, it can be a great tool in the pursuit of a mimetically balanced lifestyle. Helping, teaching, or creating for the benefit of others appears to be another genuine undertaking with powerful results. A man in Idaho recently gained national attention after he left an aggressive, successful career for an unusual goal, making beds in his garage. Shocked to learn that local children simply slept on hard floors because families could not afford beds, he began making them by hand. He made about 10 in the first year, but the experience of working towards something which was non-mimetic in nature was so influential and rewarding that he turned it into his new lifestyle, and it evolved into an organization which creates hundreds of beds per year. Girard summarizes this discussion with a recommendation for a Christian solution. Unfortunately, that concept requires much clarification. Popular culture has grown to despise Christianity, and not without cause. Yet society universally loves figures such as Mr. Fred Rogers, who are examples of Christianity as it is intended. The challenge is not the theory of Christianity when it is clearly defined, it is the execution. When the message of the Bible is decoded with a mimetic perspective, it removes much gray area in its delivery. Christianity, in its essence, is a warning about the instability of mimesis and a condemnation of scapegoating. It advises that prioritizing others above ourselves may bring unanticipated fulfillment, and to be wary that many who seem trustworthy are actually not far from being part of a vengeful mob. Yet ultimately, the path requires resisting reciprocal acts of scapegoating and empathizing universally. The biggest challenge with Christianity as a popular solution for mimetic balance is that an understanding of God is formed on an individual, personal level, but institutional forces throughout time have overwhelmingly sought to redirect this model by claiming that their interests represent God's interests. The great travesties in Christian history all begin with this structure. People have unfortunately correlated Christianity in its entirety to this format, but this does not represent Christian missionaries who risked their lives to care for scapegoated minorities in tribal nations, or people of mercy ships who provide free medical care to impoverished nations aboard a fleet of floating hospitals. There are Christians who combat scapegoating in dark corners of the world and put themselves at risk of violence or disease for no material profit. Girard supported Christianity, yet he also declared the Church to be cowardly. In failing to abandon dogma and mythology, for example Girard's criticism of the cult of saints, and instead advocate a transparent mimetic interpretation of their text, the Church continues to allow systematic failures in their design. With the rise of COVID-19, a White House credentialed pastor shared his message that the pandemic was sent to punish the world for transgender children. If Christianity served its purpose in defining and fighting scapegoating, these types of tribal witch hunts would no longer be possible through the institutions of the Church. Isolated extremism is perhaps even less dangerous than the broader damage, which is the numbing of the masses to the actual message of Christianity. Many people who self-identify as modern Christians would unquestionably have fallen in line with Nazism in a different time and place. A vast amount of people in Nazi Germany similarly believed they were good people who did neighborly things. There is an overwhelming difference between being a common citizen and being someone who understands, identifies, and refutes scapegoating. When the Christian institutions fail to isolate this reality, they fail to serve their basic purpose. It is not surprising, then, that the Church served no material threat to the rise of Nazism and was simply tweaked internally into what they coined as positive Christianity. Historically, there is only a footnote that a small minority of German Christians put up a resistance to their doctrine. The setting of World War II has become a standard reference point, but it is used here simply for familiarity. The reality is that there are many systematically suppressed topics on the West supporting scapegoating genocidal regimes, even in recent history, for the sake of mimetic objectives. Students will recognize Adolf Hitler far more than Pol Pot. Of course, the point is not placing blame on the West or any region or culture, but it should be recognized as a universal plague. Scapegoating is not simply a feature of impoverished nations, greedy billionaires, or historical outliers. It is a never-ending temptation, with far more people primed to support it than is generally expected. It is an interesting coincidence that Girard is compared to Einstein, because Albert himself had struggled to identify this issue. Einstein uniquely broke his personal rule on avoiding lectures at universities in order to speak with the first university allowing black men to earn degrees. In this speech, he referred to elements of scapegoating as the white man's disease, drawing on their cumulative experience as black men and his Jewish background. But of course, with Girard's full exploration of the topic, it is a measurable problem across all races, cultures, and timelines. Although Girard recommended a Christian solution to the challenge of mimesis, evangelism was not his primary goal. His largest concern was a cataclysmic scapegoating event. Globalization and education had reduced tribal scapegoating in many ways, but it was replaced by a looming risk as everyone was shifting to the radical right end of the mimetic spectrum, particularly in the new digital world. In combination to these social pressures, weapons technology had become so potent that a single error in judgment could result in global disaster. This threat is less theoretical than it may seem, as these men could testify. Humanity has already set itself up for failure in multiple instances where only a single person stopped global thermonuclear warfare. Girard expects our design to only increase the frequency of these events and increase the likelihood of the responsible person agreeing to push the button. In addition, our weapons continue to increase in complexity. With options like bioweapons at play, it may not even be necessary for someone to choose to attack. A simple accident could impact the world. As international power games continue to grow our exposure to risk, we must consider how everything derives from our choice of position on the mimetic spectrum. For the times we wished for the journey of Neo or Frodo, Girard has good and bad news. Our popular fantasies are only so enticing because they are closer to reality than we expect. We are living out a struggle against a shrouded pressure which influences everyone around us. After taking Girard's red pill, we begin to see that most are unaware, and sadly the few who understand are only using their knowledge to control others for personal benefit. With this introduction to Girardian anthropology, hopefully a reprieve from these influences is found so that students may consider independently their desired personal balance on the mimetic spectrum.